Can I welcome Assembly members and members of the public, both here and watching on webcast, to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. Our main item of business today is a discussion with our invited guests on modern slavery. But first, we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we begin this discussion. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag Assembly Police and Crime and hashtag Modern Slavery. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. First item, apologies for absence. Can I ask our clerk, Jonathan Baker? Teresa. Yeah, Teresa, if any apologies have been received for today's meeting.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Duval and Assembly Member Hall, and in addition, Assembly Member Boff is attending as an additional member today.
Thank you. Also, can I, on behalf of the committee, I would like to offer our congratulations to Consider Dick, CB, QPM, Commissioner of the Police, who, following the announcement in relation to honours conferred by Her Majesty the Queen, has been made a Dame Commander of the British Empire in recognition of a public service. Thank you. Item 2, Declaration of Interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at Agenda Item 2? Noted. And can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items of the agenda and other relevant interests? None? No. Okay, fine. Item 3, list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee as listed in the report? Thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, which is a discussion with our invited guests on modern slavery. First, I would like to welcome our guests and ask you to briefly introduce yourselves. If you can start off with you, Paul.
Morning, my name is Paul Wylie. I'm the Director of Strategy at the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime. I'm also the co-chair of the London Modern Slavery Partnership Board.
My name is Tamara Barnett and I'm the Head of Office at the Human Trafficking Foundation.
Good morning, Phil Brewer, Detective Superintendent. I have responsibility for the Met's Specialist Crime Vulnerability Unit. I'm also the lead responsible officer for modern slavery within the Met.
I'm Mercia. I'm a domestic worker myself and the coordinator of the Voice of Domestic Workers, a self-help group run by and for migrant domestic workers, campaigning for our rights and welfare in the UK.
Thank you. So we've got a number of questions on the specific sections to ask of you. If I can start off with setting the scene, so to speak, the background to this issue, which the Archbishop of Westminster some 2 years ago on the Evening Standard did a major investigation into this subject, described modern slavery as, quote, the dark underbelly of London society. So London has some, and this is a question addressed to all of you, London has some of the highest numbers of modern slavery victims in the UK. So from your experience, what types of modern slavery are most prominent in the capital? If I can start off with you, Paul, and then we move.
Of course. So what we've tried to do with the London Modern Slavery Partnership Board is bring together the police, first and foremost, in kind of MOPAC's kind of oversight role, but actually to convene third sector and statutory partners to effectively kind of answer that question. What we found through our kind of many conversations is that by bringing the Met's intelligence to the meeting, we can then compare that with colleagues such as Tamara and others to get some real-time feedback about what they're experiencing, because we all know this is a crime that unless you actually go to look for it or ask for it, it doesn't necessarily get reported to you. So it's so important that actually the Met has incredibly good stakeholder and partner links, and that's what the Partnership Board seeks to achieve. In answer to your question, what type of offences we've most commonly coming across, it's interesting to see the journey from when the Met and NCA first started this properly in 2015-16. They were identifying the areas that they were coming across anyway, like particularly sexual trafficking. Actually, the stats and the approach is moving far more into looking at a much wider grouping, particularly forced labour. So about a third of the stats coming through in that regard now. And then other issues that are, again, more hidden, including domestic servitude and hospitality. But there's always a kind of an industrial link to some extent.
Fine.
Tamara, from your experiences?
I think the data is very reliable in this area. One of the challenges is we tend to find what we're looking for. So historically, as Paul said, the Met looked for sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. We're broadly recognised now that actually labour trafficking is almost certainly a larger group, partly because of obviously the sort of types of trafficking in labour involves larger groups of people. So the data is very unreliable. I would say I really welcome MOPAC's focus on labour and domestic servitude because that's historically been ignored. But I think in terms of the data, it's also about thinking about what's not really being reported. So now we're beginning to recognise, for example, criminal exploitation of young British children. We used to only focus really on, for example, Vietnamese children being exploited. So it's looking at what we're not really recognising. So now we recognise the exploitation of British girls, for example, but we have a bit of a blind spot around the exploitation sexually of British boys. And there's other types of areas like sham marriages and these kind of other areas which we haven't really explored. And domestic servitude is one that I know MOPAC's looking at, but it's incredibly hidden, partly because it's not organised and the police historically have always focused on organised crime. So these domestic servitude cases are very, very hard to uncover.
Thank you. Coming to you, Superintendent Brewer, and thank you for sending us some information yesterday.
That's fine. I'm sorry it was sort of last minute.
No, it all helps.
Just really leading on from what Tamara says, and I think it's a really important point. I mean, I'll run through the stats in a minute as to what's been reported, but we all know how hidden this crime is, and the fact is the more vulnerable you are, the less likely you are to report it to us. So it does give a bit of a sort of a distorted picture. That said, just to give you a little bit of potted history, so I took over the unit from Kevin Highland in 2014. As Tamara said, very much focused around sexual exploitation. In terms of labour allegations, reports of forced labour, we had 7 in 2014. And the reason I point to that is when you look at the stats that I've looked from the National Referral Mechanism for the last for this financial year, forced labour, we've had 513 NRM referrals. Forced criminality, and this is the first time we've counted this as a standalone separate from forced labour, is 408. Sexual exploitation, 305. So it puts into context how things have changed. A lot of that is to do with some of the work that we've done with our NGO partners, with local authorities, that the whole sort of government agenda throughout from about 2016 in raising awareness has given people to report an understanding that they're being exploited and to report those allegations. So it's resulted in a complete change in terms of landscape.
Right. And finally, Mercia.
So we've been working with migrant domestic workers for the last 10 years, and the difficulties we have with the current system at the moment is the absence of the prevention, which is giving the domestic workers enough time to be able to adjust, to adapt, to understand what's the system we have at the moment. In the last 5 years, and previously, it was easier for us to help and support domestic workers who are coming here. We basically do rescue operation. We go to household where they work and if they reported being abused, and take them out of that household. But taking them to police is harder now. Before was easier because we know they could renew their visa. So even their near expiry, we know they could renew the visa. But now it's hard because they couldn't renew the visa, and most of them have no documents. So we couldn't tell if they have visa or not. So it's harder to take them to police because of the absence of, we don't know that they have visa, and they're also very scared. And in our experience as well, and in many cases that we have had, it is sometimes, let's say if the employer reported them missing to police, and mostly they got my number. I became the suspect. So I would immediately take them to police station to say that they actually ran away, they have escaped, and that they're not coming back. But now it's harder for me to go to police and take them immediately. So it's the absence of sometimes
Documents.
documents. But also we recently talked to Phil Brewer of what happened to the incident in Camden before. Yeah, so which I talked to them to you later on.
We'll be asking questions about referral services, the response of the police and so on, but very specifically in terms of the types of modern slavery, you mentioned domestic servitude. Is there anything else that concerns you? Any other type of modern slavery?
Referring them to NRM, is that what?
No. The types of modern slavery. So you talked about domestic situations.
So when we're talking about abuse on domestic workers, it's physical abuse. They've been beaten. There's sexual harassment. There are rape as well. We do rescue them immediately if they talk about they're being molested by the male employer. We do act quickly. But the problem we have with the national referral mechanism, you need evidence, you need witness, and domestic workers who are working in private household couldn't produce that evidence. So the problem is there, and it has to be taken forward.
Okay. So just moving on, I mean, you gave us some statistics, Detective Superintendent Brewer, and thank you for that. But we know that modern-day slavery is a hidden crime, which is underreported. So if you were going to estimate the true scale of the problem, how many victims of modern-day slavery do you think there are in London? And then it's the same question to you, Tamara, as well.
I think it's where you set the scale in terms of, or that point as to what you consider to be modern slavery. I mean, we always talk about modern slavery. We've spoken about modern slavery for years, but in terms of exploitation, that is a very small part of what we see. So I think if you were asked me to put a figure, I'd say there are thousands of people within London who are exploited, and that may be in, say, an example of car washes, where the issue of holding someone might not be there, but the fact is you've got someone that is working for £3.50 an hour, living in extremely poor conditions. That is exploitation. So it is really where you set the bar in terms of what you consider to be modern slavery and what you don't.
We did have many failed cases on NRM.
Sorry.
We did have many members with failed cases on NRM because if they said about they didn't receive salary, they didn't have day off, they couldn't produce an evidence of that. And to me, the way NRM system works is we needed to be raped, to be beaten, to be starved to death, to access protection. I think there's a big difference between, we should properly differentiate workers are workers, victims are victims. I think that's why I said the prevention side on domestic workers is really very important, that not all of them are really victims of modern slavery or trafficking. I'm not sure about really the definition, but it seems that domestic workers doesn't fit in there. And as I've said, with the referrals we had, there's only few who pass, but that is only on the basis of the first round. What is that called? The first round?
Reasonable grounds.
Reasonable, yeah, positive reasonable ground. But the conclusive ground is even harder to pass, which we only have few pass.
Tamara,
Yeah, I'd echo both of the points they've made, Phil and Mercia. I think the challenge is we don't know the numbers, but what you see in the data each year is it increases by about 30 or even 50% each year, which suggests if we keep on putting the focus and the spotlight on it, we're going to find tens of thousands in the next few years. But I think the challenge, as Marissa's highlighted, is if you look at the government data, they boast a lot about the fact that they've had this increase in referrals. But if you actually look at the other end, which is how many victims then get recognised by the government system of support, it's actually stayed pretty low. I think it's like 12 or 15%, or it's been a fairly low number, and it's actually stayed the same for the last sort of 6 or so years. So what that suggests is, yes, the people on the front line are identifying more victims are self-identifying, but the system has such a stringent level of what abuse amounts. Is it one hit? Is it a rape? At what point does an exploited domestic worker be recognised as a victim of trafficking? So actually the challenge is at the other end of the government system, most victims of trafficking aren't being identified, but we know we would consider that exploitation. It's just what that term means for different people.
Okay. I think, Andrew, you wanted to come in.
I'm very pleased that most of the guests has mentioned sexual trafficking. There seemed to have been a change of view about trafficking for sexual purposes. Do you think the Met's attitude has changed recently? Back in 2016, there was a thing called Operation Lanhydrock, which was intended to find victims of sexual trafficking. About 100 officers were used to carry out that operation, and the operation was carried out in premises used by sex workers in Soho. It was a glorified immigration raid and nothing else. There were no victims of trafficking found. Are we going to see that happen again from the Met, or have they learned?
Andrew, I would put hand on heart and say I hope it never happens again. I actually understand the issues of that. I think there is slowly but surely a change of attitude generally around these crime types. And you know, when I look at how the Met dealt with brothels, maybe sort of when I first started, it's very much about an antisocial behaviour issue. So the response is we get an order. We throw a load of vulnerable people out onto the streets and make them more vulnerable, and we close the premises, which cannot be right. We're working, and you know, we've worked for years with you know, I'll name 2 organisations that have been absolutely fantastic for us: Rahab in Kensington and Chelsea, Tamar in Westminster, and we do joint brothel visits. And the whole point of that is both organisations offer outreach work for sex workers. And we have the scenario where we will go into a premises and you will have a conversation with predominantly women in those premises who will tell us, we're happy to be here, this is a lifestyle choice. Now, we all know what lifestyle choice may be in terms of those women, but sometimes there's very little we can do from a policing perspective. So actually working with those NGOs, it means that we don't just leave them and walk away. They are able to build up a rapport. And in fact, I met with Rahab last week, and they told me about a woman that they first engaged with 7 years ago who had been adamant that she wasn't a victim of exploitation. The fact is that now she's beginning to disclose. So there has been a change. We need to make sure that it's not just the specialist units that have that mindset, and that we're definitely seeing a difference and a move towards more of an approach to tackle vulnerability at a BCU level as well.
Dialogue is better than a dialogue between the authorities and the sex workers is better possibly than shutting down their...
Absolutely. You know, it's a complex crime. You know, I don't think there are many sex workers that... I'm sure there are some, but there are many that didn't make that choice because they wanted to make the choice to do that. There's a story behind every individual that we come into contact. There is a story, a complex story. And, you know, working together, we need to understand those stories so we can make the right approach and make sure that we're doing the right thing by them.
And does the Mayor recognise that subtle change in policing tactics is more likely to produce a good result?
Absolutely. The Deputy Mayor and I chaired the first of our partnership boards back in June 2017, and we took a very conscious decision with Phil and the partners around the table to actively look not at the areas which are kind of the issues that are already coming at us in terms of sexual trafficking and sexual abuse, but actually look at areas that are receiving less attention, because actually it's only because you cast a light on them that they actually become more of an issue. In response to your kind of direct question, the Mayor has been very clear that immigration has kind of no part in this type of law enforcement. These people are victims first and foremost. He's written to the Home Secretary with the backing of London's Victims Commissioner, Claire Waxman, to make that very clear, because we've had a few instances about 18 months ago where that wasn't happening. So he's been very clear with the Met, with the Home Office, that the victims comes first.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, following from that, can I ask you what work is being done at the present moment to encourage victims to come forward and report, and what more can be done? So from your perspective, Paul, then if I move to you, Tamara, Phil and Marisa, so what work is being done currently, if you can be specific, and what more can be done?
So what we've tried to do with the partnership board is effectively kind of 3 phases of work. First is around getting our own house in order in terms of City Hall and being that kind of beacon of excellence, to actually encourage corporations to remove some of this through their supply chains. Second is around building the intel, supporting the Met, getting our partners to feed into that, so that we can broaden the intelligence picture and the problem profile beyond what's coming at us already into those other victim services. And then thirdly, to identify either from the victims that are being now identified, what services we can provide through the Mayor's Victims and Witnesses Service, what services can be identified through the Mayor's Victims and Witnesses Service, which is £22 million commissioned each year, and also where we can collectively amplify our messages to increase awareness. So things like domestic servitude, how we can work together to get greater cut through. The Evening Standards work was excellent for that, but actually, what I think we all agree that it needs very targeted work, particularly at the statutory agency level, because most people will not be able to identify the difference between a person who's here without leave to remain and they are victims in their own right, and someone on that spectrum, as Phil says, who's actually in modern slavery. So it's all about identifying within the statutory and the third sector what we should be looking for, and then making sure the victim services are there.
I think last year the Mayor in his budget set aside a specific sum.
That's for a campaign?
Yeah, my understanding is that it was meant to help set up an advice line. Can you tell us more about that, how it has been spent?
Absolutely, and a lot of that was from good advice from you, Chair, and the Deputy Mayor's conversations. What we actually did was take that sum of money, so there was £600,000 for all of the violence against women and girls, female genital mutilation and modern slavery. We took the modern slavery element of that, which was £125,000, to the Partnership Board at the back end of last year, and had an entire workshop based on feedback from the Met about this is what the Intel's picture is telling us, and broaden it out beyond sexual trafficking. And then we workshopped what area most needs amplifying in this campaign. And actually a decision was domestic servitude. So an agency called Kantar has been appointed, and they are doing field work right now to develop behavioural questionnaires and impact assessments in terms of how we can encourage communities to recognise that domestic servitude can be a problem in their area, and how we can change that behaviour, and how we can then prove and evaluate it so we can make the case for even greater investment.
Can I move to you, Tamara, then? So what's being done to encourage victims to come forward, and what more can be done?
Well, I mean, there's a huge amount that needs to be done. I think and there's a huge amount of sort of elephants in the room in terms of the fact that it is a multi-agency approach. The board is really important. It can't just be the police. It can't just be the local authorities. It can't just be the NHS, and communities. It has to be everyone working together, and that's a real challenge going forward. And obviously, there's some real challenges in terms of government policies, whether it's around immigration, around funding for social care. But I think the two kind of big challenges are, I guess in terms of around policing, it's improving training, so improving identification. I mean, the Met's trafficking unit is very, very good now, but sort of on a borough level, it's a lot more hit and miss. I think we can say, and there's some sort of good practice and there's some quite concerning practice. And as a result of that, we're seeing some victims of trafficking being criminalised. Obviously, there's been a lot about the county lines type cases, and there's much more awareness, for example, of British children and their vulnerabilities and why maybe they shouldn't always be criminalised. But if you look at actually, there was a case last week, the vulnerable people whose houses are often taken over, so-called cuckooed by the gangs, what we find is that those individuals, in the case last week, that individual was imprisoned with the rest of the gang. But those individuals, they're victims, for example. Their houses have been taken over. They're often physically or even sexually abused. So we're seeing a lot of types of vulnerable people still being criminalised in the system. In terms of the support, that's the other big area of concern, certainly for our sector and our organisation. And there's three kind of areas of where the sector is weak. So there's the pre-national referral mechanism. So the government provides short-term support called the national referral mechanism. But before a victim of trafficking enters the reasonable grounds decision that Marissa mentioned, it doesn't provide support or housing. And so we know police, for example, have identified a whole range. They've vented a nail bar. They found 10 individuals who are potential victims of trafficking. But even if they're police or local authorities, they're struggling to get emergency accommodation. And so some of these victims might actually get lost before they even enter the NRM. And then within the NRM itself, the National Referral Mechanism, I think a lot of people assume that everyone just goes into it and gets support, gets a roof over their head. Actually, only about 20% of victims of trafficking in the NRM get housed. About 40% a few years ago, I don't know what the data is now, went into asylum accommodation, which is completely inappropriate in most cases. It's actually very unsafe. We have entire families in one room with no access to cooking and sometimes young babies. Or they go into local authority housing, which can sometimes work, but actually there's a lot of bad practice. There was a case that had a case review in the last year. It's called Drina. You can find it online. It was in Barking Dagenham. And the woman was a very vulnerable young woman with severe sort of mental health and learning difficulties. And she was just put, they needed accommodation, they didn't have anything. So they put her in a dementia care home, which put the people in a dementia care home at risk and also the woman herself. And then the final piece of the puzzle is when a victim of trafficking exits support, let's say that's all gone well, they have managed to be housed pre-NRM and during the NRM or had the right outreach support. But when they exit the NRM, they actually have access to nothing. Being recognised as trafficked doesn't actually give you access to anything necessarily. And so what we've heard from actual police officers, particularly with male victims who often struggle to access support, there's less support services for them in the NGO sector, is that they get re-trafficked. We've had a police officer tell us he referred the same man into the NRM multiple times, 3 times, because each time he entered the National Referral Mechanism, he was then exited. So although the government says, yes, we've identified 7,000 victims, we have no idea what's happened to any of the 7,000 victims when they exit. There's no data on it, and the anecdotal evidence is very concerning.
Come to you, Phil.
Yeah, so I'll start off with probably the easier questions. There's lots that can be done, absolutely, and really just going over some of the points that Tamara's already made. Training is absolutely part of it. In terms of the training that policing get at the moment, it is an online package that is that's put together by College of Policing. 45-minute input for something that's complex, and I would suggest, having watched that, you probably end up with more questions than you had answers. There's some work that we've done. Some of the things that have worked well, and I say they've worked well because we've seen an increase in the number of referrals that police officers have made, have been things such as the multi-agency training that was delivered a couple of years ago. That worked really well on 2 points. I think it was appropriate in terms of giving people the knowledge that they needed. Secondly, it brought different people from different organisations together in the same room to talk about some of their experiences. That worked really well. And hopefully we've got some funding to actually roll out the train-the-trainer process again to local authorities. One bit that Tamara said that I think is really, really key, and this is about when we first meet a victim of crime, any crime, particularly with this crime, it's absolutely important that we gain their trust. Because if we don't, we end up with that scenario of someone deciding that actually it's probably better for them to stay with their exploiters than it is to go into the system, hoping that police, the authorities, will support them properly. Again, as Tamara said, one of the big issues, just to give you an example, is probably around labour exploitation. In my experience, male victims, they've come to the UK if they're from outside the UK for one sole purpose, and that is to earn money to provide for their families back home. What they don't want to happen is to be picked up from somewhere they may have a small community network, say in East London, where they may have an opportunity of getting some work, picked up and then moved to, say, Manchester, where they've got no community ties whatsoever, absolutely no chance of work. And, you know, this should be a process that's about giving people their confidence back, making them feel like a real person. Yeah. And unfortunately, the processes that we have at the moment don't do that.
Right. Okay, can I ask you a specific question before I move to Mercia? 2 years ago, the mayor talked about modern slavery ambassadors for each of the London boroughs. My understanding at the time was it would be a local civic figure, and you talked about action at the borough-wide level, Tamara. But later I was subsequently told by the deputy mayor that it was actually going to be a police officer. So what's happened to these ambassadors? I certainly have never heard of any of them. You know, in the patch that I represent in the Assembly, East London, do they exist? I mean, and if they do, what do they do?
They're out there, and we've kept it quite simple. We're just about to refresh the whole process because, in true Metropolitan Police style, you train one person one day, in 2 years they've moved on. If we're lucky, 2 years. So we're just about to refresh that. What they've had is they've effectively had an enhanced briefing. So we've got them in a room for 2-3 hours. We've given them some of the complexities around modern slavery. When they leave, I only ask one thing of them, and that is when they're working with colleagues, when they're out on patrol, within their day jobs, if they recognise something they think is modern slavery and are not sure, then to contact us and we can talk them through that. And I think it has worked. Going back to looking at the number of referrals that the Met have made, when we introduced the ambassadors, there was a marked increase in the number of referrals Met Police officers, staff made. But it is a continuous process and it needs to be refreshed.
If you can give us further information about the statistics in terms of how the referrals have increased and so on. And
I will do. If you want to ask another question, my laptop's closed down, so I'll just have to reboot it.
Yeah. Right. So, Marissa, can I move to you in terms of very specifically what more can be done to encourage victims to come forward?
While I know that there are so many things have been done already, but it's really easy to say than in practice it's not happening. There is a domestic worker who complained of not having salary for many months, and she was beaten up very badly by this employer and called the police, and she was blood because she was hit in the head. And this police brought her to immigration, to airport for deportation. So it's always about immigration status, it's not about the abuse. So if this could be improved, I know they keep on saying it's totally different, it's separate, it should be separate, but in practice, what is happening is always about immigration and not about the ability for domestic worker to fight for her unpaid wages. You know, she's now in a safe house in Birmingham. But in terms of her pay, that is always still unclear. Now, I also received early morning Sunday a call from someone I don't know. So she told me that there's a domestic work on train and we had to wait in King's Cross for her. So she's on board on train begging. I think she begged them that do not take her back to her employer because her employer will bring her back to Qatar and surely she will die there. So she begged for her life. And the people there put her on train. But she was stopped in the middle of the train station, one of the stations with the police took her out from the train and actually called the immigration to check about her immigration status. This has to be always about immigration status. Well, clearly she is running away for her life. And so things like this that should be in place, you know, if police are being trained, there should be some they should know what to do, what to deal with these domestic workers. We also brought to police station one domestic worker with bruises in her body. So it's a clear physical assault with evidence, But nothing has been done until now to find the employer who assaulted her, Or is this a case of modern slavery, trafficking? We don't know at the moment. So taking the trust, as you mentioned, is really important. I remember taking one domestic worker to police station. So she was interrogated for 1 hour, and after that, they let us go. But what surprised me, because she changed her number, was I complained of harassment from employer who called and texted me nonstop asking her to go back to her. And also, my phone was also have this set of call, automatic from police, non-stop, even in the middle, 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock. So that's why I encourage the domestic workers, the only way to solve this problem of harassment from your employer, from police, is to step forward. I take you to police. I say, don't worry, I'll speak to lawyer. If you're happy, if you're not scared, if you are scared. So, but then I managed to take her there, and then at the end of it, for the police to give her number to the employer again, because we changed her number. I think that's a breach of trust, and who would step forward if this is broken? Now, we've been doing a lot of raising awareness. I think I'm grateful for the police to come to the Voice of Domestic Workers to do the raising awareness, and that also helped them to kind of be more comfortable with the police. But again, these are what the cases that I mentioned was very recent, and then they've been hearing this. So it's really difficult for us to encourage them to step forward and report abuse. And the problem we have really at the moment, in terms of immigration status, because I think if you are a migrant, it's always about your immigration status check. So, the policy that we have at the moment automatically criminalize domestic workers after losing the 6 months visa. So not allowing them to renew the visa is making more exposed to vulnerability and exploitation. So the right to renew the visa is really important, and the change of the policy if we are very concerned of preventing this very serious crime.
Thank you. I think Andrew wants to come in.
Very quickly on those incentives to come forward. Surely one of the biggest incentives is going to be give that domestic worker or worker, in fact, traffic worker, the right to remain. And yet in between 2015 and 2017, 4 in 10 of non-European victims of trafficking were denied the right to remain. How can we provide an incentive for people to come forward if by coming forward you're going to be told you're going to be sent back home?
I mean, I can only agree with you. I mean, it just seems crazy that you've got someone that makes that massive choice to come forward, and you can't underestimate what they must be going through to do that. They find themselves, particularly as non-EU nationals, when they enter that asylum system, straight away they're denied the right to work. And so, the whole point, and so the only way you could work is by doing something under the radar, which again puts you in a really vulnerable situation. I can't,
that's not so much the issue about being unable to work, it's the fact that there isn't an incentive to come forward if you're going to be told to go back to the place you fled from.
But this is one of this is one of the conflicts of government policy that we've sort of wrestled with over the years in terms of modern slavery. On one hand, a non-EU national comes forward because they've been exploited, and then they find themselves part of that assessment as for asylum and for remaining within the UK, and they've just not worked.
The Mayor has spent a lot of money recently on giving advice to EU citizens about their status. Isn't it about time he gave some advice to non-EU citizens about remaining in the country?
So in terms of your sentiment, the Mayor agrees entirely with you. The Victims Commissioner convened 2 roundtables on this very subject. We identified a series of reforms that the Mayor then wrote to the Home Secretary setting out, including things like reinstating legal aid for immigration cases. Because you're absolutely right that you know, it is in many ways kind of an imaginary handcuffs of an individual who feels trapped because they can't neither tell the police because they're afraid of immigration, nor tell anyone else in their community because of stigma and other things. So these individuals are trapped on that kind of spectrum. There are opportunities. So the government's domestic abuse bill, which was in the Parliament, has just been prorogued. There are opportunities to make changes in that. Unfortunately, it wasn't in the first draft that's gone through second reading, but you know, if and when the bill does come back, we've got opportunities in committee stage, and certainly the Mayor is working hard to lobby to ensure that his changes are at least considered, because that would help as well.
Thank you. Right. A final question on my part. I'm conscious of the time, and then I'll hand over to Senator O'Connell. But can we just know a little bit about the perpetrators of modern slavery? We talked about the victims, but a little bit, and this is the question is to all of you, but very briefly, an idea of who the perpetrators are.
So we had Frida Frida Met bringing its intel picture to the Partnership Board, and then us having roundtable discussions to feed into that. In many ways, the perpetrators are as varied as the offences. So you'll have domestic servitude being either people deliberately abusing them because they can, or in some cases, you know, in some communities, it's felt like they're actually helping the individual to have a different life in London. You know, and that's a sort of attitude change that must be broken because it's just fundamentally wrong. In other things, in terms of sexual trafficking that we've discussed already, you know, I think often it's an entirely criminal enterprise, organised criminal gangs. With construction, for example, which we've looked at in detail, it can be, it's almost certainly again criminal in terms of the gang that convenes these individuals, and they prey on the immigration status that we've already described. But it's to answer your point, there is no single perpetrator of all modern slavery. They are as varied as the offence.
I would absolutely echo that. It is essentially a range of people, and I think one of the challenges, particularly with some cases like domestic servitude, what we've heard anecdotally is often the police are confronted by a very vulnerable individual who's a victim of domestic servitude, who's often very poor. They might not have the language skills. And the perpetrator, a lot of them, if you follow again the cases in the papers, a lot of them work in the NHS or they're lawyers. They're often very high-profile people. They speak fluent English, if not are British. And so there's a real challenge often because the survivors are the power imbalance does unfortunately impact on the outcomes. And if you look at the data, for example, around compensation, I think only about 1% of all victims actually access compensation. So if you're a trafficker, it's a very safe crime to commit because you're going to make quite a lot of money and you're unlikely to ever have to pay it back.
So I don't avoid the last question that I didn't answer. Just in relation to Met referrals, in 2016 the Met made 93 referrals, 2017 177, last year was 263, and we're on course for around about 300 this year, just looking at the first 2 quarters data. I've seen a wide range of perpetrators of modern slavery. I've seen extremely well played out, well organised criminal groups that are able to work internationally. I've seen chaotic groups that effectively take the opportunity to exploit someone that is in a vulnerable position, whether that's through labour or sexual exploitation. And I've also seen from a domestic servitude setting, one family exploiting one individual. So it is extremely wide and varied.
Well, last year we've rescued 83 domestic workers from different parts of United Kingdom as far as Scotland. only 5 of them managed to receive positive reasonable ground. But there is also a lot of complaints, so many complaints from domestic workers who sometimes couldn't attend all these interviews that they need to do because they need of them to work, and especially employers don't allow them to attend, to go, so there's nothing couldn't be done. But I think there's a very messy current NRM at the moment also. There's a big problem with the current system we have with the NRM. Sometimes if they couldn't attend, they are being reported as missing. And that is not helpful because the more they will be scared, you know, and the more they will hide again. On terms of the passage of passing the conclusive ground, there's also, with the lack of evidence, witnesses that they couldn't produce, we tried to, I'm not sure if that is helpful also, but even government couldn't provide this counseling to help them recover from trauma, which we managed to find some funding, not to everyone, but at least that helped them a bit. But there's really a big question mark on the importance on each and everyone to do their part. We are doing our part, but it seems like 80 of them, we don't know where to take them forward. So it seems everything is just in limbo.
Okay. I mean, so before I hand over to Assemblyman O'Connell, we have a Bahraini youth group here who come to observe British political institutions in practice. And I think Assemblyman Disco and myself are meeting them later, but in the meantime, welcome. And we are talking about modern slavery.
Right. Okay, thank you, Chair. Under the Chair's guidance, I'm conscious of time as well. So I've got some questions about subjects that have been touched upon already, which is county lines and cuckooing. I think I pronounced that right. So it has been touched upon. I want to ask some questions around that. This is a subject that this committee has talked about and asked questions about for some time, but it's clearly, I mean, only this week in that must-read periodical, The Guardian, had a spread particularly about, a really good article about that. So I want to talk about that, particularly with the London context. So really the first question, do you agree that there has been an increase in county lines, and the understanding of that is and I want your feelings about the impact of import/export of the issue regarding London. Are we a main export of that issue out to the provinces? I had a conversation with a head of constabulary in the West Country who bemoaned that subject. Or is it an imported issue affecting Londoners? And then we can hear about your opinions around cuckooing and about the victims in respect to that. So probably go down the line. Paul, you were nodding furiously. What's your thoughts about those two subjects?
It's worth saying in the partnership, or we deliberately chose not to look at county lines. I'm not dodging the question. I will talk about it in a moment. But the reason being, as I said before, we wanted to identify issues that were not being picked up by other groups. So the Mayor's Police and Crime Plan has got it in there firmly, and it's the regular subject that we discussed at the Mayor's London Crime Reduction Board, the delivery group that sits below that, and the Violence Reduction Board.
You're cited on that work.
Absolutely. So you may have, as you see, The Guardian have done a series of articles, very good, this week. The Mayor's also put out some statistics this morning, which show just how kind of prevalent this issue. In answer to your question, yes, London is definitely the exporter in this issue, exporting, unfortunately, kind of the serious violence that you see in some parts of London to the provinces, and what we've tried to do, working with the national government, working with Devon and Cornwall, who's the lead NPCC force, is set up that response and rescue service, and that's the statistics that were coming out this morning. Okay. It is a very serious issue. It is again an issue that unless you go looking for, you don't find. So these are again scratching the surface, but it's very significant.
I want to look at it through the context of trafficking, because many of those young people who are being exploited by criminals are being abused and trafficked in that context. Tamara, would you agree with that analysis?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of exploitation, and there's a real grey area where we see this in other sectors of trafficking, but the victim, you know, as they get older, often might become the perpetrator or some part of the perpetrator sort of network. So that's a real challenge, I know, for the police. But I think certainly it has increased, but I actually think, broadly, as you're saying, it's something that's been around for decades. It's more that, it's the same with CSE, actually, or domestic violence. You know, our mindsets about what a victim is has completely dramatically changed compared to several decades ago, let alone a decade ago. So I think we're beginning to finally, as I said, where we did with Vietnamese children, somehow recognise their vulnerability, and we actually have struggled, I think, to recognise British children as vulnerable. I think there's a sort of a whole philosophical issue behind that of why that might be, but essentially I think it's been around for decades, but certainly it has increased. There's sort of market reasons probably for that, but the exploitation is complex, and yeah, that victim-perpetrator line is complex. And as I mentioned, the people whose houses are being cocooned are definitely a victim group that seem to be, partly because they're often adults, completely ignored, but we know that they're incredibly vulnerable and really shouldn't be being criminalised. Okay,
I'll come back on cocooning in a minute. Phil, your thoughts from a Met point of view?
Yeah, I pretty much agree. I mean, we know it's something that's increased because of the number of children, London children, that we're finding outside of London. So just looking at it at its bare bones, we know it's a model that the gangs have identified as a big money earner, relatively safe for the main organisers because it puts those children in the place for selling the drugs. So they're the ones that are likely to get picked up. They are, whether it's a code of not snitching or whether it's through fear, there's unlikely to be any comeback to the individuals that are running that criminal enterprise.
And it's often the profile of those victims who are being used are targeted because they may not be of a high suspect range in those towns and cities.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of a safeguard for someone that is running children is that, you know, even when you look at the Section 45 defence within the Modern Slavery Act, if you know that person you are exploiting or is selling drugs on your behalf can claim that they are a victim of modern slavery, it probably puts less chance of you finding yourself being identified as the person that had organised it. It is such a complex method because, as we've already said, some of our victims aren't what we'd recognise as traditional victims. Indeed. You know, their backgrounds have an impact on why what's happened to them has happened. You know, whether they've gravitated towards the wrong people within their community because the parents aren't around or for whatever reason. Right. And you know, you've got that sort of the loyalties are probably somewhat sort of in the wrong place.
I'll ask Mercia in a minute for her thoughts, but my last point is on cuckooing, which is again sometimes misinterpreted by communities. So this will be a house which will be taken over by people and the person in that house or of ownership of that house. But often that person is seen as part of the problem by the community, but who actually are a victim. That was your point earlier, was it, Tamara? I think. Yes. And that's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, they often have, I think there's a real challenge between the Drugs Misuse Act anyway and the Modern Slavery Act, because when the police have both in their hands kind of thing, the Drugs Misuse Act always kind of overshadows really the statutory 45 defence, and so what we are finding is that most victims, it's easier for the police to kind of see someone who's seems to be involved in the drugs gang because it's in his or her house, might be obviously is taking drugs themselves, they usually have addictions, which is one of their vulnerabilities. So yeah, they tend to be criminalised just because of the sort of weight of the law and the different types of legislation out there.
Okay. Mercia, did you want, on this specific subject, did you want to bring in any comment on?
In terms of...
We're talking about county lines and cuckooing. Probably may not be so relevant, particularly in your field. No.
Okay. We in terms of the statistic on overseas domestic, from 2012 it lies between the incoming domestic workers, right, 15 to 16,000, but we recently asked is now 22,000 visa issues to domestic workers. Now, it's really hard to follow them up with the absence of, because supposed to be the Home Office should deliver an information meeting, which will make it easier for us to follow what's happening to domestic workers. But it has been, I think they're not going to do it again already. So for the reason that they haven't really announced publicly. And it's hard to follow up also how many of them stay, how many of them go back to respective country or to the employers who brought them here. It's really hard to find that. But that 85 domestic workers we rescued last year is a big one. And now we are already have this year from July, we already have 25 domestic workers. So we are counting again for this year. So, but to really follow up the cases wherein it's hard because they're moving, like if they move from house to another household, it's really hard to follow what's happening to them. But in terms of the national referral mechanism, I think not many domestic workers are really understand that or recognize that they themselves are victims of trafficking.
Absolutely.
Thank you very
much.
For them, just a very simple of they just want to work.
I understand that. Thank you.
Can we move on to the next section, because I'm conscious of the time to keep repeating myself. So it's effectiveness and the impact of the London Modern Slavery Partnership Board. Caroline, to lead on.
Yes, that's right. And I want to focus my first batch of questions really to you, Paul, to really understand this. And obviously, you've all covered a bit this morning, and Tamara talked about the board is so important, bringing everyone together. And you said earlier, Paul, that the work of the board is focused on things that aren't picked up by other groups. Yes. So what I really want to understand for you, it was set up in June 2017. You've had 8 meetings so far. What have you actually delivered in that time?
It's a fair question. So the minutes are all online. Yeah. I'll kind of point to 3 areas. So the first is kind of ensuring that City Hall is a role model to be followed. So we've actively fed into the Mayor's Good Work Standard. The kind of colleagues from GLA business were attending many of our meetings, and groups like Flex actually helped them develop the 3 tiers of the Good Work Standard that relate to modern slavery, which is really promising. But also in terms of the ethical procurement approach that City Hall has. In terms of our buying power, as through the GLA family of the Met, Fire Brigade, etc., it's huge. So ensuring that our supply chains are excellent and therefore can be role model to others. Second, as I mentioned before, is that arrangement of getting a greater group of people to feed into the Met's intel and problem profile. And Phil and I have discussed this a lot. It has definitely moved the manner in which the police can have someone focus, because if you've got good colleagues from charity sector, etc., telling you that something's going on, it allows Phil to change his tasking arrangements to actually go and look for it. And then thirdly, convening particularly around victim services. So Claire Waxman, London's Victims Commissioner, has attended many of our meetings to understand in terms of her role for advocating for the VCOP, the Victims Code, and also the immigration issue that we discussed before, just ensuring that they are kind of live issues. We're taking them from colleagues of real-world experience and actually playing it into the lobbying that the Mayor does.
So I can see, so a practical thing you've done is City Hall is a role model, the GLA group, but that's very concrete, you've got stuff in place. The other stuff feels a bit softer, we're making sure it's on the agenda. It's not actually delivered yet, has it?
So what we took a decision, and again it's in the minutes at a very early stages, this is not an executive board.
Right.
Colleagues around the table are either there in a voluntary capacity, or they're kind of as kind of feeding into the operational colleagues. Phil has got tasking arrangements. He's kind of well tied into the National Crime Agency's work through Op Hadent, which is an NCA lead. you can already convene all of the enforcement agencies. What we were very deliberately moving away from that to be more of a convene and communicate body, so that we can amplify the good work that colleagues in the charitable sector are doing, and making sure it's actually influencing in a good way what the Met's doing.
And obviously, from what you're talking about, really, it's the whole systems approach is what you're trying to, that's one of your purposes of the board. Can you give me a practical example of what you've achieved through having this whole systems approach?
So, looking at an area such as domestic servitude. So when we had our initial problem profile and intel picture from the Met, some really good assessments of what they were seeing in terms of the types of crimes, and as I mentioned before, it was largely in the sexual trafficking. We've moved, as a result of these conversations, and I want to pay tribute, especially to Tamara and the two groups that she chairs outside of this board. There's been real movement to understand different types of offences. So domestic servitude wasn't on that radar in any significant way before. Now it is. And as a result of that, we were able to identify that the money that we have for modern slavery campaign should be targeted at that group, which is why we commissioned Kantar to do the behavioural analysis of that community, and then understand what creative campaigns will actually have the most effect. As I said, they're doing the field work right now. By the start of the new year, they'll be doing kind of creative campaigns in those communities. And then what we were really keen to do was actually build in the evaluation. So it is a whole systems, because we'll at the end of this process have through controlled trials, know whether you've actually had any impact on behaviour. And if you can do that with good evaluation, you can then feed that into victim services and buy something even better next time.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And then looking forward, what are sort of the desired outcomes you've got for the board, and what sort of long-term impact are you intending to make on this problem of modern slavery in the capital?
So for the last two sessions, so in February, we had most of the session actually dedicated to a review of what we'd done, what was working. We posted a board at it, what was working, what hadn't worked so well, and specifically what we wanted to do for the next 18 months. One of those questions was, should we disband the board? Because you should always, I think, in these sort of boards, check whether it's actually, has it just become a talking shop?
Fit for purpose, yeah.
There was kind of unanimous agreement. We wanted to continue, but we wanted to adapt it. So rather than in those first two phases be about kind of other groups coming to us to seek the advice of good colleagues around the table, we were actually going to do some workshops around problem areas that we know aren't being addressed properly. So we identified 3 areas: housing and homelessness, which we had in, I think it was May. In July, we had a workshop on hospitality, and then we've got scheduled for the back end of the year one on child sexual exploitation, because it had been a while since we'd looked at that. And in those, we used design work. So we were getting a colleague with the expertise to present to the group on what they're aware of already, taking that information to then innovate and come up with as many good ideas as possible, in terms of volume, filter that down to the ones that would actually be any good in practice, and apply a kind of convene and communicate filter, because we were all very conscious that actually what we're not talking about here is commissioning entirely new services or asking the Met to do something entirely different. This is about how do we amplify those work. So homelessness, hospitality and child exploitation is the next area.
So that sounds like really interesting work you're doing, and obviously you effectively were trying to look at as a board how effective you were, looking at whether you even needed any more. Do you have anyone independent coming in? Clearly the campaign you're doing, you're assessing. Do you have anyone independently measure your effectiveness and your impact, or is that something you might consider?
No, we don't. And yes, I think that's a good idea, particularly as we reach the end of this phase. Again, I want to keep asking the question, are we adding value, which is our number one ambition, because this is an incredibly complex and national arrangements. You know, regardless of what you think of Theresa May, she's driven a lot of this from the Home Office and then as PM, which means that a lot of law enforcement is actively looking at this space now. But we've got to make sure that we are actually adding value to the good work that others people are doing, rather than just duplicating, which is the real danger in this space.
Okay, and then finally I wanted to ask, and then widen it out to the panel, should London have a specific place-based plan to tackle modern slavery as it does, for example, for violence against women and girls and knife crime?
It's a very good question. It's one that we've considered both at the start but also in February. What we determined, though, is that for the first time this was a serious part of this Mayor's Police and Crime Plan, which is what the Met take as their lead. It's therefore in the Met's direction, 2025, and also in their business plan, which is kind of real objectives. And then in terms of should it have a bespoke additional strategy over and above what the Police and Crime Plan is seeking to achieve, actually there are very few examples of us producing a separate strategy because of the complex or very serious nature of it. So you've got knife crime strategies and the VOG strategy, as you say, but there aren't any more than that. It is worth saying in the January 2018 VOG strategy, modern slavery is a key part of that throughout, and that kind of intersectionality of issues, be it immigration, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, individuals who are subject to modern slavery are going to be addressed through those victims' work too.
Okay, thank you. Phil, can I come to you next? Yeah. You perhaps could answer that question about, do you think there should be a place-based plan to tackle modern slavery, but also perhaps a little bit on how you find the partnership and whether it is working, whether there's areas you'd like to see more focus?
In answer to your first question, I'm always going to say yes anyway. This is something I'm absolutely passionate about, as you probably know. There needs to be, I think within policing, there needs to be a culture change on so many levels, and that's that interaction. And one of the things that I always think about with this is we're very good at asking our victims and witnesses how things have happened, but we don't always ask our suspects, and that's where sometimes we miss that victim-suspect area. So I think, just as an example where we need to change maybe culture of how we deal with things. This, as Paul's already said, this is a really complex matter. If you strip it apart to its sort of key components, you've got a lot of different crime types that sort of are encapsulated into modern slavery, and they completely vary in terms of offending and victim profiles, etc. In terms of considering it as modern slavery impacting on London, we account for 1/3 of all NRM referrals. So, we take the lion's share of all those allegations of crime. Although not all of those have been committed within London, it does make up a significant number of crimes. I would expect we will see over, I would say probably around about 3,800 referrals this year. So in terms of that, I think even if it had a focused approach for a relatively short period of time, I think it would set us on the right road in terms of what we need to do to have the right policies in place, ensure that we've got the right partners around the table to work with us, because as we've said several times, this isn't just a policing issue. This is, if you're going to look at tackling modern slavery properly, you need that coherent approach across so many different sectors, and that's probably where the coordination is most needed.
Lovely, that's very helpful, thank you. Tamara and Marissa, do you want to add about whether you think there should be this place-based plan, and any other comments you've got on the partnership?
I do agree on the sense that, as Paul says, it does cover so many areas that there's a complexity about it, because it actually should already be in any VOG, should be in any CSE, it should be in any county lines, criminal child exploitation documents, it should be covered in all other strategies. But at the same time, I'm obviously going to echo what Phil also says, which is obviously we would really welcome some sort of strategy, partly because we're sort of at, we often say in our sector we're where domestic violence was 25 years ago. We're now at the cusp where it's not quite understood, not quite recognised for the sort of terrible heinous crime it is. So I think a strategy could be very useful, and we have quite a lot of challenges. There is some very good practice, and I really feel has done some great work just in terms of collaborative multi-agency approach. But on a borough level, I think there are some serious challenges. I'm sure you as individual assembly members probably see some of these cases in your casework. And I mean, in terms of the data, I think 7%. I mean, this is across the UK, not just London, but I think 7% of all cases investigated by police of trafficking, only 7% refer to the CPS. And some of that is because a lot of exploitation happens abroad. There's lots of reasons why that might be, but there's also clearly a slightly worrying bit of that data that probably needs to be investigated further. And if you sort of compare like for some countries, there's a report by Nusrat-ud-Din, particularly looking at conviction and prosecution rates between the UK versus some other countries where there's more support provided, which is obviously something I talked about earlier. So the data comparing 2016 data between the UK and Netherlands, UK had 98 prosecutions and 39 convictions, where the Netherlands had 311 prosecutions and 109 convictions. So it really shows that wraparound support. It's very hard for the police to do their work if they don't have, for example, that emergency accommodation in place and that long-term holistic support. And it really, all those pieces of the puzzle need to be dealt with. And there are things that can be done. We've talked about at the when we talked about homelessness, we talked about the gap around pre and post NRM and what the mayor could potentially do around that. We've seen sort of PCCs, for example, in West Mercia and Thames Valley, have sort of funded, for example, pre-emergency accommodation and other things. I'm aware the mayor, not through MOPAC, but through some other organisations, funds advocacy for the Eastern Human Resource Centre and Spreza programme, which is an Albanian NGO. So those are the kind of things that are really, really important, and they really do add value because, as I've shown with the convictions and prosecutions, it really it is expensive short term, but long term, the police and everyone it is worth the value.
Thank you. Mercia, have you anything to add?
In terms of conviction on the employers from outside, there's only few. But in terms of because even they apply in the national referral mechanism, if they pass, they do have this piece of letter of that. Those who have visa and they pass, then they have this right to work. But those who didn't pass, those who didn't have visa anymore and they passed the national referral mechanism, they couldn't work. Those who pass, like I'm dealing with the current domestic worker who has not received salary from April to June. So I wrote a termination letter just to help her. They have these difficulties in writing, so I help her write and ask about and put everything there in the letter. To me, just to create produce an evidence that she's not been paid. So I wrote 2 letters, and then I say you need to get out of that already, because I don't think so that employer will ever pay you. And then don't worry, we will take a solicitor to take this case to tribunal. And this employer is not actually responding, at all. So I asked the solicitor, can we make this case a high profile to shame, this employer? But again, there's a big question if the perpetrator is British. Is there such thing as internal trafficking? I think is hard, because we did have one member before whose employer British and abuser and didn't get the positive reasonable ground because Home Office is not an internal trafficking. Yeah, but anyway, for those domestic workers who didn't have the right to work, although under in NRM, of course couldn't find, because many employers actually they couldn't understand, or they still simply don't want to understand whatever it is, so they couldn't fight the case because they don't have the right to work, so they couldn't step forward. But also there are also who are many there are also who have many who didn't apply and are now undocumented, and we know they are being abused, of course couldn't step forward. So there's so many perpetrators that we couldn't really take on because of this problem. So those who didn't have right to work, of course they shouldn't be working, but internally of course they are working because they need to work. they need to support their
Okay.
family. So there's a big problem on that side that I think.
So
we
that's
should look
something
at.
you would want in a strategy if there was one, yeah?
Yeah.
I think just 'cause time, Chair. Okay, thank you.
Andrew?
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to talk about support for victims, and I think we've covered a lot of that ground already, so I don't want to go back over subjects that we've looked at already. There are one or two things of detail. I think we've already talked about the processes that are in place. But I wanted to ask Paul a bit about the money. You've already talked about the £125,000 for domestic servitude awareness raising, which the Chair asked you about at the beginning. But I want to ask you about a couple of other pots of cash. The Victims Commissioner has £47 million for investment in services for victims of crime over 3 years. How much of that is being invested directly in services for victims of modern slavery?
Which pot, £1 million, did you say?
The 47 million.
Oh, sorry,
for
47, yeah. So,
services for victims of crime.
Yes. So, so within the overall victims' work, there is. It goes back to the intersectionality point earlier. So, you, for modern slavery, you victims might come across in terms of the Lighthouse, the child sexual abuse arrangements. You've got sexual assault referral centres, London Survivors Gateway, Children's Victims and Witness Support Services, and then more widely, what this the Victims and Witnesses Service provides is like an end-to-end arrangement. So as soon as an individual is identified as a potential victim, they receive that victim support contact person, and he or she has taken that throughout the course of the journey. We have a good colleague from Victim Support who attends our partnership board and kind of regularly feeds in.
So how much of the £47
practice.
million is spent on victims of domestic slavery?
So,
of modern slavery?
So I can't give you a figure in terms of how much is earmarked for modern slavery because it's not cut that way. It's all about providing a seamless service for victims more generally, and then specialist services where domestic abuse or sexual services applies.
You don't know the answer, or you can't find the answer?
No, there isn't an answer to a specific question around what's for modern slavery.
So
But it is important, as we said before, the offences are so varied that it's actually all about these symptoms.
Along the same lines, perhaps you could tell us this, though from what you're saying you probably can't. The Mayor's committed £70 million in services supporting victims of violence against women and girls. How much of that has been spent on supporting women and girls who are victims of modern slavery?
So yeah, it's the same answer. There is no. What that pot provides is services for a range of symptoms of victims. We don't cut it in terms of identifying it for kind of certain types of modern slavery because it's modern slavery, as we've said before, it's a catch-all term for many different types of. So a sexual victim of sexual trafficking, for example, would have access to rape crisis centres, would have access to sexual assault referral centres. A domestic servitude victim might have access to the domestic abuse side of things, but
basically you can't answer how much has been spent on it.
I'm sorry, maybe we were talking across purposes. That's not the point. It's that
what you're saying is that these victims have access to generic services rather than specific targeted services.
So in addition to the generic services, as we've kind of touched on already, we haven't got into any details, the national referral mechanism, actually it's the government's responsibility to then provide the bespoke human trafficking victim services to that individual. There are serious problems with the NRM, as we've already discussed, and the Mayor's been very clear about that with the government. But in that kind of pre-NRM stage, it is the responsibility of Salvation Army. In the post-NRM stage is commission services that the Home Office provide.
I mean, we've got all that from your previous answers. I was just
Sure.
asking about how much money is being spent, and you can't answer that. Can I go on to Tamara and Marissa? Again, some of this we've covered already, which are the key problems facing victims and where the gaps are. We've particularly covered, I think, support in terms of accommodation and also problems involving the immigration service. Is there anything else?
I mean, there's a whole range of things. So, I mean, mental health. It's really. I mean, that's not just for our sector, of course, but it's very, very hard for victims of trafficking, even with very high needs, to access mental health support, and that can actually be used against them, for example, if they have an immigration claim, because they're told they're not accessing mental health, but in fact the queue is so long that they can't access it. Compensation, as I've mentioned, is another huge area of challenge. Translators, it's very hard across the UK, let alone in London as well, surprisingly, to actually access adequate translators. So these are all sort of really services that our sector really struggle with. But in terms of housing, it's not just the housing, but it's the advocacy. So potentially, I appreciate in London, housing is a huge gap. I mean, there are some really good services, and it really does make a difference. I think, so Pccs House, for example, is outside the government system. It's funded by, I think, the Catholic Church. And their data shows that a lot of victims they support don't agree to go into the NRM, but after 6 weeks, 60% do agree to go into the NRM. So it shows how valuable that housing part is. But if you also look at organisations that just offer advocacy, so they fight for the housing and all those kind of holistic areas, so Hope for Justice is an organisation that provides advocate support. The victims they support, 73% will agree to work with the police. It's much, much higher than the average.
So taking advocacy,
yep.
Demand and how much the demand is met. I mean, to what extent is there shortfall in the availability of advocacy?
So there isn't enough. I mean, I'm sure Marissa can talk about this as well, because there's, for example, an organisation called Calayan who do some advocacy work for victims of domestic servitude. But, Marissa's managed to find literally single-handedly about 83 in the last year. And Calayan is a very small organisation. They don't have enough services for that. So there's a huge gap in advocacy. And you obviously in other areas like domestic violence, and we have IDVAs and ISVAs, we would really, really like some IMSAs, independent modern slavery advocates, to support victims of trafficking. It would really help the police, because as I said, they're much more likely to work with the police.
Can you try and quantify what the gap is? Is it half the victims don't get advocacy, a quarter don't get advocacy?
I'd say it's more than half.
More than half.
The majority of victims, I think, unfortunately fall through the gaps. That's what we're seeing. So we really need more. We really need advocates, not more. We hardly have any. There's very few organisations like Calayan or Pccs House out there, unfortunately.
On Monday, the charity Unseen that runs the UK Modern Slavery Helpline said that it was at risk of closure because it's funded by donations which have dried up. Who should be funding that service?
Well, everyone's a bit surprised that Home Office isn't funding that service. I'm aware that I think some police authorities do fund it. I don't know if MOPAC do as well. And it was historically funded initially by Google. But the Home Office has sort of led on the awareness side of it. But obviously we really feel the Home Office should deal with that funding gap.
Okay. And I think we've already covered what happens to victims before and after they enter the national referral mechanism, and the big issue there when they come out is immigration control. Can I ask you what services are in place to support male victims of modern slavery?
Yeah, can I just say it's not just immigration, there's a huge part, but a lot of victims of trafficking are British, and they really... I've worked with survivor families who are British and have amazing families around them, and everything still goes wrong. It takes years to get housing, it takes years to get safeguarding. So even when you're British, unfortunately, the system really does not work. Just to highlight that. And sorry, the exact question now. But
yeah. Sorry. Well, before you go on, I mean, of the people you come across that were victims, what proportion are British and what proportion are overseas nationals?
So increasingly, I think British is one of the largest
number one UK nationals now.
Groups now. That's probably also linked to the fact that, as Marissa's talked about, that a lot of victims of trafficking who don't have that immigration status are going to be worried to go into the system. So the system is inevitably, now that we're finally recognising British victims as victims, we're going to see those numbers be higher. But we know a huge number of British people are still sort of under the sort of cover, as it were.
So I was asking about support for male victims.
Yeah. So I would say that's a huge gap. If you look at Calayan, for example, that they support victims of domestic servitude, who tend to be all female. Pccs House is a brilliant organisation, the 60% data that I mentioned, but they only support single females. So there's a huge gap in terms of male victims. And these sort of multiple referrals where victims of trafficking go into the NRM multiple times, anecdotally, one hears that they almost always are male, because there's literally not, the men leave the safe house support and then they become destitute, and then another trafficker targets them. So I think that's a huge gap, and we really, that is somewhere that not just advocacy, but probably housing does need to be funded around that.
Going back to the immigration issue, I recall when I was looking at this when I was in Parliament, which is about 14, 15 years ago when we did a report on people trafficking, one of the big issues was that when people were removed, either voluntarily or less than voluntarily, there was a huge risk of re-trafficking if there wasn't support networks in the home country. To what extent is that still a problem, and maybe it's a matter for Phil to comment on, as well as Tamara, to what extent is that still a problem? Do we find people who are who go back to their home country, Albania or wherever it happens to be, and then suddenly reappear shortly afterwards?
So we actually did a report with the Romanian parliamentary group last year about the experience of victims returning to Romania, and it was Romania is seen as much more organised than countries like Albania, for example. So a lot more Romanian victims are probably likely to be made to return.
Yeah, but that was certainly something we picked up 15 years ago. Yeah.
But what was shocking was it was much worse than I thought. And some of the NGOs within the government system that supported victims who are being returned said they tended to find that when victims return to them, they then get re-trafficked 5 times on average, which was much worse than I could even imagine. So unfortunately, it's not a very good system in terms of returns. A lot of the complexities are not really dealt with by the NGOs that are around internationally.
Because I mean, I may be wrong with this, but I vaguely recall the convention, the UN convention, saying that people shouldn't be returned unless there are support mechanisms for them in their home country. Am I right about that?
Yes, so a lot of these countries will say they have support mechanisms. So Romania does, but what one finds in practice is a lot of the system. It's a very complex problem, and a lot of the NGOs don't. For example, the access to mental health services. It's not good here, but it's not good here. It's even worse in a lot of countries, and particularly in the poorer parts of Eastern Europe. So what you're finding is that they aren't really able to offer that holistic support that's required in these countries of origin.
There's a risk of being disowned by their families.
That too, but often their families are involved potentially in exploitation. So what you find is they return to the area where they were exploited because they have links there, and actually these are a lot of the vulnerable circles that they were in initially. But then if they're not returned to their families, then they're completely isolated. So you've got this sort of challenge of should we return to that at-risk community, or should we isolate them and try and build a new community for them? And does the NGO that you return them to does it have the access to build that community for them, which a lot of them do not?
Do you want to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, Tamara's stolen all the best bits.
All right, okay.
It's so just to give you an example, we've got since 2015 we've had a seconded Romanian officer within our team, which has worked brilliantly, and in some respects has dispelled the myth that Romanian nationals that we come into contact are scared of the police, because actually it's had the opposite effect. When you're talking to someone from your own country who understands your background, actually they're more likely to want that to come forward asking for care and support. But it's a complex system. So what we can do, if our victims want to return home, through our police officer, through the embassy, we're usually able to arrange someone to meet them. But exactly as Tamara said, one of the big issues, particularly from the Romanian Roma community, our victims will gravitate back to their towns and villages that they grew up in, which is where they were recruited and exploited by their neighbours, family members, etc. So it becomes quite difficult to actually break that cycle of exploitation. And it's been our experience as well. We will see highly vulnerable people not accessing the right support when they return home because it's not available, and subsequently they return to the UK or they're exploited in country.
Okay. You say you've got Romanian officers seconded. Do you have other countries seconding officers to your section?
So within the Met at the moment we've got officers from Poland as well, although our number of Polish exploited victims that we see is relatively low, so they're involved in other areas of work. I think we've got 4 Romanian officers at the moment. One that has got a background in modern slavery, so she's permanently attached within our team at the moment, which is fantastic. And the others are supporting the other BCUs across London.
Okay, thanks. And last question, I think, for Tamara. How does the support differ between adults and children victims?
So currently the government system is only for adults. It's assumed that all support for children will fall under local authorities, and that's as a result, unfortunately, we know children are not getting any type of specialist care in many cases. So the government has a child trafficking advocate scheme, but it hasn't been spread yet to all of London. Only Croydon at the moment has the child trafficking advocate scheme. So as a result, a lot of children aren't getting the kind of specialist care that they need, and we know some children, particularly, for example, Vietnamese children, are very likely to go missing after they're identified. And unless you've got that specialist training around foster carers, for example, they won't know the right things to do, like removing their mobile phone, all these kind of things that needs this, that extra awareness with trafficking victims isn't often there in the childcare system. So we have some concerns that children are often sort of missed out because the government's focus in terms of support anyway is around adults.
But the problem with children has been around a long time. I know for Vietnamese kids, the problem was always using them to grow cannabis farms and that sort of thing. Is that still the problem?
Yeah, so cannabis farms and obviously nail bars are the two sort of main areas that we know for Vietnamese children.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? No. Okay, moving on to the next section then, resources and training, the next response, Claude.
Thank you. We touched on this just briefly. So one of the things we are looking at is in terms of if this unit is properly funded. So just coming on to the first part of the section, just looking at the Met's response to slavery over the years. Just wanted to get your views on that, Detective, Superintendent and Paul. Do you feel that the focus has changed?
I think there's been more focus on modern slavery. I'd still wish we had more of a sort of, and I say business as usual, and I don't mean to be flippant with that, but more of a, that our cops are going out and recognising modern slavery within their sort of day-to-day business. I don't think we're quite there yet. In terms of training, there are a number of options, but at the moment it's competing against other areas that also require additional training, etc.
So I would add that it's now in the Met's direction, which is a kind of their forward-look strategy, but also their business plan. What you've seen more generally is a move in policing kind of away from just identifying crimes that are promoted to do them to actively seeking crimes, and that kind of that catch-all term of safeguarding is an entirely it's grown considerably within the Met in particular, and it's an area that the Deputy Mayor can focus on again and again. It is, as if she was sat here, kind of hampered by the amount of resources available. So if and when the government is clear that there is an increase in police officers, this is clearly an area where hopefully there will be extra work.
So in the Met's business plan 2019 to 22 and 2018 to 25, it does highlight modern slavery and exploitation and its efforts to combat it. But one of the things we found is that there isn't any actual concrete plans beyond launching these hubs and some of the information and access points for young people. Just looking at, notwithstanding some of the figures we already touched on earlier, do you know, Detective Superintendent, how many officers the specialist crime and vulnerable units, how many officers you have in that unit that are specifically dealing with modern day slavery?
So yeah, I do. On paper, 189. I think we're running at around about a 34% vacancy rate at the moment. That will improve to a 27% vacancy rate in November. So they're split into, just to give the committee some idea, split into two teams. We've got an investigations team which look at modern slavery, child sexual exploitation, where clearly there's an organised element, or it's such a large investigation it's beyond the capability of a borough. And we've also got a vulnerability assessment and partnership team, so looking at improving those links. We've got some hopefully some really good ideas in terms of getting that better join up between all the agencies, both statutory, non-statutory and sort of third sector, and actually having more of a joined up approach. So it's early days yet. The unit was set up in June, but in terms of what we're seeing, I think the whole new approach is actually ensuring that the Met looks at vulnerability as a whole, rather than, as we have done certainly throughout my career, where we've got small specialist crime units dealing with CSE, sort of missing, etc. This is actually opening people's eyes to the fact that a lot of the drivers and a lot of the ways that we can stop victims becoming victims in the first place play out across a number of different crime types where vulnerability is a big issue.
And I appreciate that you may not be able to answer this, but just speaking from your professional judgment, do you feel that that's enough officers for that unit? Bearing in mind the scale of the challenge.
Again, I'd obviously say no, but I think the reality is that I don't think this crime type should ever have a specialist unit, if I'm being brutally honest, because everyone should understand modern slavery, should all be capable of dealing with it. However, we are where we are, and some of the crimes, modern slavery crimes, are extremely complex. Some of the cases that we've got entering their arrest phase now are on the back of over 2 years' worth of work that has been international. So when it comes to capability, you know, that we will need a specialist unit to deal with that. I think where there are some reasonably quick wins is ensuring that people have a proper understanding of the complexities of modern slavery throughout the organisation. And as I say, going back to an earlier answer I gave, you know, even if it is for a colleague who might be usually walking sort of up and down Southwark High Street, who recognises a beggar that may be a victim of modern slavery, that they do no more than call us, we can then talk them through the action to take. So, yeah, there's always more we can do, yes, absolutely.
There is. And those vacancy rates you quoted are quite high.
Yes.
Is this because of the sheer caseload that officers are dealing with, or the fact that this is coming across the radar of more officers, so actually there's more reporting and more work being generated from this?
So the investigation teams are all detective ranks, so it comes back to some of the challenges that we already face in terms of a lack of detectives. So that's been the main driver. When we start to see that uplift in officers into the Met, hopefully, then we'll be in a better position. But I think if it's been on the back of a lot of change across both local policing and specialist crime, that we've ended up with the vacancy rates that we have.
And obviously the unit's quite new. You said during this year. What just briefly the priorities that you're looking at for this year?
So the priorities are we in terms of modern slavery, we've continued what we've already been doing since I took up the reins of the modern slavery and kidnap unit. So the same crime types in relation to targeting. What has changed is the type of crimes that we're dealing with. So when I first took up, most of our work was sexual exploitation. Now we have a mix of labour exploitation, criminal exploitation, as well as sexual exploitation. And also in terms of going forward, it's ensuring that we have a more joined up approach and looking at CSE, which I think in terms of modern slavery perspective is quite often not looked at, it's not looked at as much, and ensuring that actually the approach that we take to our serious and organised crime group gangs when we're dealing with drugs and guns, that same focus, same techniques, etc., are actually looking at modern slavery and CSE as well.
One of the things we've been looking at, obviously, from an Assembly perspective is the impact of Brexit on London. And we've also questioned the Commissioner and a number of the Deputy Commissioners around the impact of no Brexit and no deal on policing. What impact do you think a no-deal Brexit would have on the Met's police to address this issue of modern-day slavery in London?
Could get me in all sorts of trouble with the Commissioner now, aren't you? The key bits for us is one thing I've mentioned to the committee is that we at the moment have 10 joint investigations. So they're a mechanism that we're able to enter under Eurojust, which allows us to work jointly with other European countries. So the majority are Romania, but we've also got JITs with the Czech Republic and Bulgaria, and I think Hungary as well. It's a brilliant mechanism. We will still be able to be part of JITs. Where it starts to get a little bit complex are some of the other tools. So things such as funding. At the moment, we can lead and request funding from Eurojust. if we leave the EU, we will no longer have access to the system to apply for funding. So we will rely on the other country that we're working with to do that on our behalf. Some of how we share intelligence will certainly have a negative impact. So Europol have a system called Sienna, which allows us to easily share information between the member states and third countries. Without any agreement in place, that will effectively cease overnight until we renegotiate our membership of Europol. In terms of the basics are there. The worry is in the background, without a plan in terms of what our membership looks like, some of those really important systems and some that actually do sort of those automated checks that probably our officers on the street aren't aware that are happening across Europe won't be available to us in the short term.
Do you have any concerns about that from your perspective, Tamara?
So certainly in terms of Brexit, the two large concerns that we have are one around rights. So we use the European legislation around the directive on human trafficking for a lot of cases that I'm sure Mercia and others who've dealt with the legal systems to get access the rights for victims, they often have to use the European legislation. Obviously, there's still the Council of Europe Convention legislation, but the EU legislation is really critical, so we're really concerned what's going to happen post-Brexit. Are we going to adopt directive in full, or are we not? I think there's a fear we might not. And the other area is that at the moment, European nationals can generally be proven to show that they have worked and therefore have accessed their treaty rights, so they're able to get potentially housing and benefits. And most victims of trafficking who aren't in the EU are kind of wedged into the asylum system, whether it's appropriate or not. But the problem is when we Brexit, Europeans will join all the non-EU, but it'll be very hard for most Europeans to access the asylum system. Like if someone's from Poland, it's just not going to have the same weight as someone, say, from certain countries where obviously different laws and things. So.
Something for us to look at. Just a broad question to everyone in terms of obviously the HMIC's assessment that the identification of victims is often inconsistent and sometimes ineffective and needs significant improvement. In your experience, is this the case in London?
Absolutely. I mean, the HMIC FRS reports looked at all forces. As we've kind of mentioned before, it's very difficult to identify where on that spectrum of from someone who could arguably can be complicit into the modern slavery definition. It's a very difficult determination for people who are trained in it, let alone the average person. And then even when you've identified them as potentially being in the modern slavery, for them more than half of them to fall out of the NRM, just shows that it's incredibly complex and probably the wrong judgments are being made.
Tamara?
I mean, the reports all highlighted a lot of the issues around criminalisation, which we've already obviously discussed. We sort of touched on training. I know sort of the train-the-trainer model that Phil spoke about. I know we're in discussions with MOPAC about whether that could be continued, so that's something that we're really keen to carry on because, the train, there isn't really, the local authorities aren't given any funding at all. The police, it's sort of pretty limited in terms of the training aspect, so it would really add value. I think there's certain areas also of complete ignorance, so I just mentioned the civil orders that sort of, for layman terms, it's kind of like ASBOs that keep traffickers away from vulnerable people. But the number used since they've been introduced quite a few years ago is very, very low. And it's partly because most police and local authorities and others have no idea they even exist. So that kind of stuff is key into the training, but more broadly in terms of awareness.
You wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'd pretty much echo. I think someone once said that the only thing we're consistent at is being inconsistent, and I think that's a fair comment. And it is, we've unfortunately, I've seen examples of where two victims within days of each other have approached police within the same borough. One was treated brilliantly and first class response, and the other wasn't, and that can't be right. And I think it's looking at things in terms of raising that awareness a little bit differently to how we have done before. And we've spoken a lot about working together, and I've worked really closely with Tamara and Paul over the last few years, and that needs to feed down. So at a local level where we're talking about training, it makes so much sense to deliver that as you would within the same multi-agency partnerships that you would be working with anyway to ensure that a victim of modern slavery is safeguarded. So it's really, I think, just thinking a little bit more innovatively and actually pooling our resources and ensuring that training's not only delivered, but it's delivered with those other agencies that you'd be working with anyway.
We just really want, being in the voice of domestic workers community, because they are with us, and we do fail to provide this kind of services with them. And while Kalayaan is there, but they couldn't take them all. And we go through Salvation Army. I referred February one domestic worker because I want to try it even to the phone. It's an emergency, so I use the phone to refer her. But from January until now, there's no result of this assessment, NRM assessment. So that person, of course, couldn't move forward. What to do is stuck. So we need that kind of immediate. That's why we turned to actually try to work with the police, and we started to invite them to make the community feel comfortable with the police. And this is one thing that we are looking forward to use, because I think it's faster, we get the result. But also, is this something that the voice of domestic workers need to do already to be a first respondent? Because if not, we're not getting these services right, then we have to take this on. But to do it is, I don't have clue yet, okay? But I've been dealing with this problem every day, 24 hours. So it is a problem that we all have to solve, It's not, it is urgent, of course, that need to be done. But I think for us to really work closely together is really important, and because otherwise we are failing these workers, victims of trafficking. But I would be really very specific with the absence of the right to work, the right to change employer, the right to renew visa, the right to citizenship, when the government removed all these rights in 2012. Yes, in 2015, during the Modern Slavery Act, they reinstated the right to change employer, but with the absence of the right to renew visa, that is no use because it doesn't give them. So I just want to really make these things clear that the Modern Slavery Act trafficking law are not replacement for employment rights of this group of workers who are really very, very vulnerable. I think we should acknowledge that.
No, thank you. Just finally, for me, Chair, to Tamara and you, Mercia, what more do you feel that the Mayor of London and the Met could be doing to help tackle the issue of modern-day slavery in London?
Well, I guess it's the things, identification and support. So in terms of increasing identification is about sort of training. In terms of the support side, the thing is, inevitably, every sector wants money, and I appreciate the pot is small. In fact, housing in London is obviously the most expensive, in the UK. And I'm aware that, as I said, they have actually funded some various sort of advocacy services, not I think from MOPAC, but Eastern European Resource Centre and Spreza programme in the past were funded, and they provide kind of advocacy with particular diaspora communities. But we would really be pushing for maybe modern slavery advocates to be funded. And obviously there's this gap that was mentioned by Androdissimo around male victims particularly, and there is a bit of a gap. There is a Lalo House for male victims of trafficking, but there is definitely a gap in terms of housing and broader support for men in particular.
Yeah, no, thank you. Marissa, is there anything, so you've touched on the employment, is there anything more that you think maybe the Mayor could be doing, and anything more you'd want the Mayor of London and the Met Police to be doing to address some of the issues you've highlighted?
I know we've been in out of this building, and we've done raising awareness together. We are grateful for that, and I think there needs to be something like raising awareness everywhere. But I think for police to be more is there a caring side of police?
Understand.
Do they really have to be very
Yeah.
tough?
I care,
You
Marissa.
know, I mean,
I feel for you, does.
yeah. So because
empathy to come
yeah,
out.
and that soft side, you know, that
Yeah.
that you know
The
that
human side,
they feel
dealing
you know
with victims.
comfortable, you know, and
That's
not
a very good
yeah
point.
because you know employer. The reason why it's not is the reason why the domestic workers behave that way to police is because the most employers, they use police to frighten them,
Yeah.
you know,
Yes,
so
yes.
they don't go to police, they don't talk to anyone, that they talk to anyone, they will be arrested by police. It's more on
there's a
that.
perception of the police already.
So they use it as a threat,
Yeah.
you know, and that's why it's really important for us to, for police that when we go there, it's not that they're being chased away, that they're being interrogated. Yes, I think there will be more rather than interrogation. There must be other way, you know, so that it encourage them more. And I think that when I first met with Phil, actually, I think we talked more about this police coming to us, talking to domestic workers. But when we invited police, I didn't even tell them that the police are coming. So, but I say they don't wear uniform, so it was fine. So I think. So, but I think after the session, they do ask, they do interact with the police and during the discussion. But we also asked this question of, so are you going to agree now that if we go to police, you're happy to go there, or we call 101 hotline? So maybe that's the fastest way to solve our problem, because there are so many who are not referred yet to NRM. And we need to do more, because you know, anywhere, anytime they could be arrested because of this stop and search policy. So I think the urgent for them to be referred to NRM is urgent and immediate, but at the moment it's really a big problem. Yeah, so 85 only has been referred, 80 is in limbo, and after we don't even know where they are now, because they all just try to find work somewhere. So some of them become undocumented because of that failure. But yeah, I think it's good for us to work together in public, that they see us, you know, that they are not actually scary. Yeah.
No, that's good. That partnership approach is really strong, I'd say.
Yes.
No, thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Anyone else? No? Well, can I thank you for attending today and for your answers to our questions? Can I ask the committee to note the report, the discussion,
Noted.
and delegate authority to me in consultation with party group lead members and Caroline Pigeon to agree any output from the discussion?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Item 5, work program. Can I ask the committee to know the progress on our work program? Thank you. Our next meeting is on Thursday, the 3rd of October at 10 a.m. in the Chamber City Hall. And as I have no other urgent business, I close this meeting.
Thank you.